Hi everyone, this is William Lee back with the third installment of the Romanov Dynasty of Russia. So last time, the last episode was devoted to terminology, so maybe not the most exciting, but anyway, that is out of the way and the basics have been established. And from here on out, I'm mostly going to be referring to the great princes as Grand Dukes. And so, and at this stage in Russian history, the ruler is the Tsar, not the emperor, but the Tsar. Okay. And Gosudar also, which means sovereign. So, as you know, if you've already been watching, the focus of this series is on the dynasty, the Romanov dynasty, and its interaction with the Russian state, and sometimes as two institutions that are very much integrated and functioning and with the same goals, and sometimes as rival institutions, with the state wanting to be the center of things on the one hand and the dynasty wanting to be the center of things on the other hand. And that's really sort of the central theme of this whole series, is that division within Russia in the up until the time of the revolution. And then, maybe eventually we'll talk about even a little bit about how that, here and there we can talk about how that carried over into the Soviet period and beyond, into Russia nowadays. Okay, so within that focus of the state and dynasty as both cooperative and at times rival institutions, we are looking in particular at the Grand Dukes, the ones that were not heirs to the throne. The heirs to the throne also had the title Grand Duke, but we're looking at Grand Dukes specifically who were not heirs to the throne, and we're looking at them in relation to their identity as servitors of the state, alongside parallel to their identities as Romanovs and loyalty, who swore allegiance to the Tsar or the ruler, him or herself. Okay, and they can tell us a lot as a sort of microcosm of what was going on between the dynasty and the state overall. So we are starting today in 1613, and so we're going to spend a little time on the 17th century. And during the 17th century and most of the 18th century, there simply were no Grand Ducal servitors, because there were no Grand Dukes who made it to adulthood, who could take on an actual service role. So all of this that we're talking about now and in episodes to come is to lay the groundwork for when finally in the late 18th and throughout the 19th and into the early 20th century, there were Grand Dukes who were pulled in these two different directions. And if we're going to understand that and how the dynasty was functioning overall, we need to start at the beginning of the dynasty. So that is where we are going. So Ivan the Terrible was the last of his dynasty. So his dynasty was the Rurik dynasty. They had been the Grand Dukes of various powerful cities within what was at that time Rus. And then all of that had been focused, it started out in Kiev actually, and then all of that had become more and more centered. The center of power became Moscow. And Ivan the Fourth, as I mentioned last time, was the first to actually use the title Tsar and to declare himself Tsar. So what we have now is not even really Russia. It's Muscovy. And Muscovy was the center of what you could call Rus. So Rus you could call Holy Mother Russia. So in later years, even during Nicholas II's reign, when they talked about Holy Mother Russia as distinct from the Russian Empire, they're going back to this period of the 17th century when Russia was Muscovy and when that idea of holiness was at the center. But of course, that wasn't really Ivan, who was known as Ivan the Terrible, Ivan the Fourth. He wasn't what you would look at and say, here was a pious, God-fearing man who put orthodoxy and put God at the center of everything. Far from it. But part of the whole point of how the Romanov dynasty began its life and began its function was to be linked to the Rurik dynasty in order to be legitimate, but also distinct from the Rurik dynasty. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, so let's talk about the Smuta. The Smuta was the time of troubles. So this was after Ivan the Terrible died, leaving no successor. So there was no Tsar in Russia, and things pretty much fell apart. All of the lesser institutions and the sense of unity had really depended on there being a Tsar on the throne, and now there wasn't. So this was a period of, I believe, 30 years. I should have double-checked that, from the time of Ivan's death until 1613. And there were lots of rivals for control of Muscovy and the territories attached to Muscovy. And some of those actors were actually from other countries. So Poland would have loved to take over. Lithuania would have loved to take over. The Hanseatic League was interested, and Russia had, until this time, really been fighting for its survival. It had, there'd been the Mongol invasion, and the Mongols for 7 generations had been the real powers in Russia. And finally, the Mongol yoke, as it was called, had been cast off. Well, now all of a sudden, in this vacuum where there's no ruler and everything is in chaos, these other powerful countries want to come in and take over. So that's a big part of the troubles of the time of troubles. And there were also various competing individuals who wanted the throne for themselves. One of them was called the False Dmitri. And the False Dmitri was a pretender. He claimed to be the son of Ivan IV. So Ivan IV had had a son named Dmitri, but that Dmitri had died at the age of 9. And so this false Dmitri was saying that no, Dmitri's death had been faked, and he'd been taken to a place of safety, and he'd been raised there, and now it was his time to come forth and reveal the throne, and take the throne, reveal himself and take the throne. And this is an interesting current throughout Russian history. Going to the period well after the revolution, maybe even today for all I know, of pretenders saying that I am such and such member of the royal family who you thought was dead but actually survived. And probably the most well-known of those was Anna Anderson, the woman who claimed to be who claimed to be Anastasia, the Grand Duchess Anastasia, and said that she had actually escaped and she hadn't been killed. But there were others. There were even a couple in Soviet Russia who claimed to be Alexei. Okay, so hold that thought, and as we go along, we'll talk about more pretenders. So there was the false Dmitri, and he did not succeed. There was a man with a surname that you will recognize. His name was Fyodor Romanov. And Fyodor Romanov was from a boyar clan. So the boyars were the noble clans, the name for the noble clans in Russia. And the Romanovs were pretty much at the low end of the spectrum when it came to boyar clans. Yes, they were acknowledged as boyars, but they were almost they were kind of overlapping with this new group of people who were coming to the fore, who were basically middle servitors, not nobles, but the kind of people who would do bureaucratic and administrative things and that sort of thing, and the kind who were soldiers but were always on duty as guards or things like that, and not just armed men that were raised by the boyars. So the Romanovs were, they were kind of overlapping that category. They weren't a powerful boyar family. They weren't an old boyar family. But the reason that they were in contention for this, the reason they were contenders, was because Ivan the Terrible's wife, his second wife, I believe, and not the mother of his children, who were all dead anyway, had been a Romanov. And she had predeceased him, but apparently he'd been very much in love with her. And I would recommend to all of you the early Soviet-era film by Sergei Eisenstein, Ivan Grozny, or Ivan the Terrible. That's a brilliant film. Old black and white, but not silent. Okay, so the person who ultimately succeeded, albeit for a very brief time, was a man named Boris Godunov, who declared himself to be Boris the First, and he did succeed for a while. I don't remember for how long. I should have refreshed my memory on that before I started this. But he was Boris the First for a while. Not everybody acknowledged him, but he did sort of get a foothold. So you could compare him maybe to Kerensky during the provisional government after the Russian Revolution of 1917. He was in charge for a while. He didn't declare himself Tsar, but then everything fell apart anew. Well, so to bring an end to this horrible, bloody, tumultuous period, there was a Zemsky Sabor. So a Zemsky Sabor is a gathering of the land. So from all the different parts of Muscovy, you had representatives of all the layers of society, from the common people, the church, the merchants, the boyars, everything. They came together, and they elected a Tsar. So the first Tsar of Russia, you could almost say, was elected democratically. I mean, that's really stretching the concept, because it wasn't a democratic election. I don't know how the representatives themselves were chosen, but they were chosen, and they did come together, and they chose someone who was the exact opposite of Ivan IV, even though you would think, well, everything had fallen apart after Ivan, so maybe they would want another forceful person like Ivan, but no. They chose a 16-year-old boy, and one who was known to be quite a meek boy. And in fact, he was hiding. He'd been hidden away in a sort of monastery fortress, and when he saw the procession coming, he thought that they were coming to kill him and that it was all up with him. But in fact, they offered him, or they told him, that he was now the Muscovite Tsar. So Zemsky Sabors are another thing that we want to keep in mind. So when there were other times of trouble in Russia, for instance, after the revolution, there was suggestion that there should be a Zemsky Sabor. There should be another gathering of the land and all the verses, all the different social strata. And at various times when there were crises in Russia. And also, I should say that the word smuta itself, if you come across, if you're reading Romanov diaries or letters, if you're reading general works on Russian history, and you hear the term used in English, time of troubles, then you know that this was a concept that was still a trauma in modern Russia. For all I know, it still is today. This idea of just everything falling apart, foreigners coming in, everything falling apart, yeah, that left a lasting impact on the sort of the Russian consciousness. And so, yeah, that is something worth calling to mind. I've been doing videos on Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich's diaries, and he certainly uses that term. Okay, so we'll remember the time of troubles, and we'll remember the Zemsky Sobor and that whole idea. So Michael was chosen. He was 16, and the qualities that he had of meekness and piety were the qualities that the Zemsky Sobor decided they wanted. So the complete opposite of the Rurik dynasty with its warrior princes. Okay, and so Michael's father, who had himself been contending for the throne, was gotten out of the way by a very clever device. So he was forced to become a monk. And if you were a monk in Imperial Russia, you were absolutely banned from any role as a ruler, a regent, anything. And so once he took those monastic vows, that was it. There was no going back. He couldn't then say, I'm quitting the monastery, or I didn't really mean it. And so not only Fyodor, but his wife were, both of them were forced to take monastic vows. And Fyodor became Filaret. And so Michael's mother became Marfa. And 6 years after Michael became Tsar, Filaret was elevated to the role of patriarch, so the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. At that time, it wouldn't have been called the Russian Orthodox Church. It was the Orthodox Church, and it was considered by the Russians themselves to be the successor to Constantinople and to Byzantium. And so he was put in this very powerful role. And indeed, Michael wanted his father on hand to be the one who was making the decisions. But he was now in a safe position vis-a-vis his father, because there was no way his father could take over as emperor and push him out of the way. Okay, and another interesting little thing that goes along with that is the idea that the supporters of the Romanovs, at any rate, were saying, aha, you see, during the time of troubles, we should have chosen Fyodor Romanov, now Filaret, to be the Tsar, that was God's will. And the fact that we didn't is what brought the wrath of God down upon us. And so now that we have Michael and the Romanovs are established on the throne, we will prosper, and God will withdraw his wrath, so to speak. And I don't know how widespread that was. I don't know if that was actually something that had an impact in the Zemsky Sobor, but that was part of the mythos behind the Romanovs. And indeed, what we needed now in Muscovy was a new dynastic mythos, something completely distinct from the Ruriks, who had been, a pretty fierce lot. We need a completely new image and a completely new underlying mythos. And so we have now the idea of the meek and pious Tsar. And that makes him sound rather weak, doesn't it? But far from the case. Even though he wasn't seen as this sort of robust, active figure, there was still the idea that everything emanated from the Tsar in an almost spiritual, divine way. In fact, Muscovy itself was an emanation of the Tsar. So not in the sense that it literally came out of his body, but in the sense of, if the Tsar didn't exist, Muscovy wouldn't exist. Russia wouldn't exist. Mother Rus wouldn't exist. The Tsar was the center of this little earthly universe, and everything emanated from him. And that being the case, you can't even really talk about servitors at this period, because whether you were a boyar at the very top of the noble pecking order, or if you were a simple serf, you were a slave of the Tsar. And of course, the Tsar didn't treat his, boyars like slaves or anything like that, but that nonetheless was the sort of theocratic and temporal philosophy between the dynasty at that time. The state is not an independent entity. The state is an outgrowth of the Tsar. And the Tsar is the reservoir for all will, and the Tsar is the unique holder of the creative spark, the divine spark. Okay, so if he's not active in the sense of being this vigorous warrior king, he is nonetheless, in the great scheme of the universe, he's the one with the divine spark. He's the one who has the only legitimate will. He can delegate it, but it is all coming from him. So we've all heard of the divine right of kings, and that exists in every monarchy. I don't know if it's something, for instance, that the House of Windsor would now say, if there was a debate about whether the monarchy should continue in the UK, would they say, well, yes, because God himself established our line on the throne? I rather doubt it. But certainly at the time covered by this series, going all the way up to the 20th century, monarchy was justified in that way. But this, as you can see, is going well beyond what you would usually have in a temporal state, in a temporal monarchy, with this idea of the divine right of kings. This is really putting the king or the Tsar kind of as the creator, not just the ruler. So I would encourage you, if it's something to interest you, that interests you, when you look at if there are any particular Russian rulers that you're interested in, or Russian Tsars, Russian emperors, Soviet leaders, Vladimir Putin, ask yourself, what is the image that they are trying to project? Because with respect to the ruler of Russia, we have these two sort of competing archetypes. We have the active Tsar, who is fully engaged with geopolitical things and who is a warrior Tsar on some level, and it helps if he's big and strong, and that's the image that he's always trying to project. And then we have the passive Tsar, who's like Michael, and his power is vested in the fact that he is this representative in a very real sense of the divine will on earth. He's the only legitimate figure who has this divine or creative spark, and he is literally the center. There's no state that's a center. The center is a person, and that's the ruler. So, you kind of have the archetype on the one hand of the Tsar martyr or sacrificial lamb. Even if he doesn't actually die, he's still, he's still in that role of the uber-Christian ruler. And then you have the archetype of the man of action. And it's interesting, especially for me, to look, for instance, at Nicholas II and to see the ways in which he failed on the one hand, and I'm sure he wanted to be seen as a powerful emperor, but his emphasis and his personality and his physical size even really made him a better image of the archetypal little father spiritual Tsar, the passive Tsar, the Tsar martyr. Okay, and so let's see. An article that I really like very much, and I'll give you the full reference. before I close this, by a woman named Cynthia Whitaker, who was writing for Slavic Review, and she looked at court records. So she looked at the early Romanovs, and she wrote that Tsarist duties, what her research showed were that Tsarist duties, the actual duties and activities of the Tsar, were at that time, in her words, liturgical in form and static in content. So they weren't expanding; they were all centered on tradition, and playing out in a liturgical form. So, as though the Tsar were a bishop. Or as though the Tsar was a patriarch, although, as you know, there was a patriarch, and the Tsar wasn't in that role. They were distinct roles, but there was a lot of overlap. So the Tsar's duties were liturgical in form and static in content. And when she looked at court records, she saw that the Tsar's schedule was dominated by religious observances. So this, I'm not an expert on Western European or European monarchical history outside of Russia, but this sounds to me almost more like the medieval period of, say, the monarchy or the various princely houses. Gosh, I'm just tripping all over myself. But anyway, it seems like a kind of medieval sort of way of looking at things outside of Russia. So this was still the case in Russia in the 17th century. Maybe it was elsewhere as well. I mean, certainly it was important for the rulers to be seen engaged in the religious festivals and observances. But according to Whitaker, that was not just a sideline for the Tsars of Muscovy. That was what dominated their entire schedule. So it's really a far cry from the Tsar warrior. On the other hand, I don't want to imply that that archetype wasn't starting to emerge. So a little bit with Michael, even more so with his son, Alexei, but it hadn't, it was gradual. It was a gradual process, and it's not like, Peter the Great, when he reached his majority, changed things completely. I mean, Peter the Great being such a force of nature, to some extent, I mean, it was incredible how rapidly he changed things. But, we'll get into that later, that was one of the biggest sources throughout Russian history of trouble, was the fact that it was fairly superficial, and it didn't go and grapple with these ideas of Holy Mother Rus and tradition and that sort of thing. It just sort of ripped those away, like, ripping a Band-Aid off your arm. Okay, so yes, so it was a continuum, not an abrupt change entirely, but we still have that dominant, we still will have until Peter the Great comes to the throne and actually reaches his majority. We still have that basic mythos in Muscovy and in the Romanov dynasty. So please do come back next time, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I'm just forgetting that I promised I would give you these book references, to the sources I was using. I always hate it when I watch a video about history and I have no way of knowing what the sources were that the speaker has used in the information that they're giving. So, the Whitaker article, Cynthia Whitaker, The Reforming Tsar, the Redefinition of Autocratic Duty in 18th Century Russia. So we're not in 18th century Russia as yet, but as you can see from my reference, she also writes about 17th century Russia. So this is in Slavic Review, volume 51, the first spring issue for 1992. So the first issue for 1992, the spring issue. And then I used two Russian sources, two Russian articles from the same book. The book is Dom Romanovy v Istoria России. That was, so the House of Romanov in Russian history. That was published in St. Petersburg in 1995. The editor was a woman named O.E. Khovanova, Khovanova. And if you can find it, even if you're not a Russian speaker, if you are a Romanov researcher, it is well worth having. All right, and it has these two chapters in it. One by a person named A.V. Gadlo, бытовой жизни первых Романовых и русская народная культура, and referring specifically to the 17th century. So народная культура is folk culture. So this is talking about the first Romanov rulers and their presence within folk culture. Very interesting topic. And the other one is by I.O. Тюменцев из История избирательного Земского собора. So this is about that Zemsky Sobor of 1613 when Michael I was elected to the throne. All right. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.